Section 2 of The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Thomas. The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, Volume 1. Message from the Deep Sea by Dr. John Jones Pitcairn and R. Austin Freeman. Part 2. The next witness was a young woman named Kate Silver. As she stepped forward to be sworn, she flung a glance of hatred and defiance at Miriam Goldstein, who, white-faced and wild of aspect, with her red hair streaming in dishevelled masses onto her shoulders, stood apart in custody of two policemen, staring about her as if in a dream. "You were intimately acquainted with the deceased, I believe," said the coroner. "I was. We worked at the same place for a long time, the Empire Restaurant in Fenchurch Street, and we lived in the same house. She was my most intimate friend." "Had she, as far as you know, any friends or relations in England?" "No. She came to England from Bremen about 3 years ago. It was then that I made her acquaintance. All her relations were in Germany, but she had many friends here, because she was a very lively, amiable girl." "Had she, as far as you know, any enemies, any persons, I mean, who bore any grudge against her and were likely to do her an injury?" "Yes, Miriam Goldstein was her enemy. She hated her." "You say Miriam Goldstein hated the deceased. How do you know that?" "She made no secret of it. They had had a violent quarrel about a young man named Moses Cohen. He was formerly Miriam's sweetheart, and I think they were very fond of one another, until Minna Adler came to lodge at the Goldsteins' house about 3 months ago. Then Moses took a fancy to Minna, and she encouraged him, although she had a sweetheart of her own, a young man named Paul Petrovsky, who also lodged in the Goldsteins' house. At last Moses broke off with Miriam and engaged himself to Minna. Then Miriam was furious and complained to Minna about what she called her perfidious conduct, but Minna only laughed and told her she could have Petrovsky instead." "And what did Minna say to that?" asked the coroner. "She was still more angry, because Moses Cohen is a smart, good-looking young man, while Petrovsky is not much to look at. Besides, Miriam did not like Petrovsky. He had been rude to her, and she had made her father send him away from the house, so they were not friends, and it was just after that that the trouble came." "The trouble?" "I mean about Moses Cohen. Miriam is a very passionate girl, and she was furiously jealous of Minna, so when Petrovsky annoyed her by taunting her about Moses Cohen and Minna, she lost her temper and said dreadful things about both of them." "As, for instance?" "She said she would kill them both, and that she would like to cut Minna's throat." "When was this?" "It was the day before the murder." "Who heard her say these things besides you?" "Another lodger named Edith Bryant, and Petrovsky. We were all standing in the hall at the time." "But I thought you said Petrovsky had been turned away from the house." "So he had a week before, but he had left a box in his room, and on this day he had come to fetch it. That was what started the trouble. Miriam had taken his room for her bedroom and turned her old one into a workroom. She said he could not go into her room to fetch his box." "And did he?" "I think so. Miriam and Edith and I went out, leaving him in the hall. When we came back the box was gone, and as Mrs. Goldstein was in the kitchen and there was nobody else in the house, he must have taken it." "You spoke of Miriam's workroom. What work did she do?" "She cut stencils for a firm of decorators." Here the coroner took a peculiarly shaped knife from the table before him and handed it to the witness. "Have you ever seen that knife before?" he asked. "Yes, it belongs to Miriam Goldstein. It is a stencil knife that she used in her work." This concluded the evidence of Kate Silver, and when the name of the next witness, Paul Petrovsky, was called, our Mansell Street friend came forward to be sworn. His evidence was quite brief and merely corroborative of that of Kate Silver, as was that of the next witness, Edith Bryant. When these had been disposed of, the coroner announced, "Before taking the medical evidence, gentlemen, I propose to hear that of the police officers, and first we will call Detective Sergeant Alfred Bates." The sergeant stepped forward briskly and proceeded to give his evidence with official readiness and precision. "I was called by Constable Simmons at 11:49, and reached the house 2 minutes to 12 in company with Inspector Harris and Divisional Surgeon Davidson. When I arrived, Dr. Hart, Dr. Thorndyke, and Dr. Jervis were already in the room. I found the deceased woman, Minna Adler, lying in bed with her throat cut. She was dead and cold. There were no signs of a struggle, and the bed did not appear to have been disturbed. There was a table by the bedside, on which was a book and an empty candlestick. The candle had apparently burnt out, for there was only a piece of charred wick at the bottom of the socket. A box had been placed on the floor at the head of the bed, and a hassock stood on it. Apparently the murderer had stood on the hassock and leaned over the head of the bed to commit the murder. This was rendered necessary by the position of the table, which could not have been moved without making some noise and perhaps disturbing the deceased. I infer from the presence of the box and the hassock that the murderer is a short person." "Was there anything else that seemed to fix the identity of the murderer?" "Yes. A tress of woman's red hair was grasped in the left hand of the deceased." As the detective uttered this statement, a simultaneous shriek of horror burst from the accused woman and her mother. Mrs. Goldstein sank half fainting onto a bench, while Miriam, pale as death, stood as one petrified, fixing the detective with a stare of terror as he drew from his pocket 2 small paper packets, which he opened and handed to the coroner. "The hair in the packet marked A," he said, "is that which was found in the hand of the deceased. That in the packet marked B is the hair of Miriam Goldstein." Here the accused woman's solicitor rose. "Where did you obtain the hair in the packet marked B?" he demanded. "I took it from a bag of combings that hung on the wall of Miriam Goldstein's bedroom," answered the detective. "I object to this," said the solicitor. "There is no evidence that the hair from that bag was the hair of Miriam Goldstein at all." Thorndyke chuckled softly. "The lawyer is as dense as the policeman," he remarked to me in an undertone. "Neither of them seems to see the significance of that bag in the least." "Did you know about the bag, then?" I asked in surprise. "No, I thought it was the hairbrush." I gazed at my colleague in amazement, and was about to ask for some elucidation of this cryptic reply, when he held up his finger and turned again to listen. "Very well, Mr. Horowitz," the coroner was saying. "I will make a note of your objection, but I shall allow the sergeant to continue his evidence." The solicitor sat down, and the detective resumed his statement. "I have examined and compared the 2 samples of hair, and it is my opinion that they are from the head of the same person. The only other observation that I made in the room was that there was a small quantity of silver sand sprinkled on the pillow around the deceased woman's head." "Silver sand?" exclaimed the coroner. "Surely that is a very singular material to find on a woman's pillow?" "I think it is easily explained," replied the sergeant. "The wash-hand basin was full of blood-stained water, showing that the murderer had washed his or her hands, and probably the knife too, after the crime. On the washstand was a ball of sand-soap, and I imagine that the murderer used this to cleanse his or her hands, and while drying them must have stood over the head of the bed and let the sand sprinkle down onto the pillow." "A simple but highly ingenious explanation," commented the coroner approvingly, and the jurymen exchanged admiring nods and nudges. "I searched the rooms occupied by the accused woman, Miriam Goldstein, and found there a knife of the kind used by stencil cutters, but larger than usual. There were stains of blood on it, which the accused explained by saying that she cut her finger some days ago. She admitted that the knife was hers." This concluded the sergeant's evidence, and he was about to sit down when the solicitor rose. "I should like to ask this witness 1 or 2 questions," said he, and the coroner having nodded assent, he proceeded. "Has the finger of the accused been examined since her arrest?" "I believe not," replied the sergeant. "Not to my knowledge, at any rate." The solicitor noted the reply, and then asked, "With reference to the silver sand, did you find any at the bottom of the wash-hand basin?" The sergeant's face reddened. "I did not examine the wash-hand basin," he answered. "Did anybody examine it?" "I think not." "Thank you." Mr. Horowitz sat down, and the triumphant squeak of his quill pen was heard above the muttered disapproval of the jury. "We shall now take the evidence of the doctors, gentlemen," said the coroner, "and we will begin with that of the divisional surgeon. You saw the deceased, I believe, doctor," he continued, when Dr. Davidson had been sworn, "soon after the discovery of the murder, and you have since then made an examination of the body." "Yes, I found the body of the deceased lying in her bed, which had apparently not been disturbed. She had been dead about 10 hours, and rigidity was complete in the limbs but not in the trunk. The cause of death was a deep wound extending right across the throat and dividing all the structures down to the spine. It had been inflicted with a single sweep of a knife while the deceased was lying down, and was evidently homicidal. It was not possible for the deceased to have inflicted the wound herself. It was made with a single-edged knife, drawn from left to right. The assailant stood on a hassock placed on a box at the head of the bed, and leaned over to strike the blow. The murderer is probably quite a short person, very muscular, and right-handed. There was no sign of a struggle, and judging by the nature of the injuries, I should say that death was almost instantaneous. In the left hand of the deceased was a small tress of a woman's red hair. I have compared that hair with that of the accused, and am of the opinion that it is her hair." "You were shown a knife belonging to the accused?" "Yes, a stencil knife. There were stains of dried blood on it, which I have examined and find to be mammalian blood. It is probably human blood, but I cannot say with any certainty that it is." "Could the wound have been inflicted with this knife?" "Yes, though it is a small knife to produce so deep a wound, still it is quite possible." The coroner glanced at Mr. Horowitz. "Do you wish to ask this witness any questions?" he inquired. "If you please, sir," was the reply. The solicitor rose, and having glanced through his notes, commenced. "You have described certain blood stains on this knife. But we have heard that there was blood-stained water in the wash basin, and it is suggested most reasonably that the murderer washed his hands and the knife. But if the knife was washed, how do you account for the blood-stains on it?" "Apparently the knife was not washed, only the hands." "But is that not highly improbable?" "No, I think not." "You say that there was no struggle, and that death was practically instantaneous, but yet the deceased had torn out a lock of the murderess's hair. Are not those 2 statements inconsistent with one another?" "No. The hair was probably grasped convulsively at the moment of death. At any rate, the hair was undoubtedly in the dead woman's hand." Is it possible to identify positively the hair of any individual? No, not with certainty, but this is very peculiar hair. The solicitor sat down, and Dr. Hart having been called, and having briefly confirmed the evidence of his principal, the coroner announced, "The next witness, gentlemen, is Dr. Thorndyke, who was present almost accidentally, but was actually the first on the scene of the murder. He has since made an examination of the body and will, no doubt, be able to throw some further light on this horrible crime." Thorndyke stood up, and having been sworn, laid on the table a small box with a leather handle. Then, in answer to the coroner's questions, he described himself as a lecturer on medical jurisprudence at St. Margaret's Hospital, and briefly explained his connection with the case. At this point, the foreman of the jury interrupted to ask that his opinion might be taken on the hair and the knife, as these were matters of contention, and the objects in question were accordingly handed to him. "Is the hair in the packet marked A, in your opinion, from the same person as that in the packet marked B?" the coroner asked. "I have no doubt they are from the same person," was the reply. "Will you examine this knife and tell us if the wound on the deceased might have been inflicted with it?" Thorndyke examined the blade attentively, and then handed the knife back to the coroner. "The wound might have been inflicted with this knife," said he, "but I am quite sure that it was not." "Can you give us your reasons for that very definite opinion?" "I think," said Thorndyke, "that it will save time if I give you the facts in a connected order." The coroner bowed assent, and he proceeded. "I will not waste your time by reiterating facts already stated. Sergeant Bates has fully described the state of the room, and I have nothing to add on that subject. Dr. Davidson's description of the body covers all the facts. The woman had been dead about 10 hours. The wound was unquestionably homicidal, and was inflicted in the manner he has described. Death was apparently instantaneous, and I should say that the deceased never awakened from her sleep." "But," objected the coroner, "the deceased held a lock of hair in her hand." "That hair," replied Thorndyke, "was not the hair of the murderer. It was placed in the hand of the corpse for an obvious purpose, and the fact that the murderer had brought it with him shows that the crime was premeditated, and that it was committed by someone who had access to the house and was acquainted with its inmates." As Thorndyke made this statement, coroner, jurymen, and spectators alike gazed at him in open-mouthed amazement. There was an interval of intense silence, broken by a wild, hysterical laugh from Mrs. Goldstein, and then the coroner asked, "How did you know that the hair in the hand of the corpse was not that of the murderer?" The inference was very obvious. At the first glance, the peculiar and conspicuous colour of the hair struck me as suspicious. But there were 3 facts, each of which was in itself sufficient to prove that the hair was probably not that of the murderer. In the first place, there was the condition of the hand. When a person at the moment of death grasps any object firmly, there is set up a condition known as cadaveric spasm. The muscular contraction passes immediately into rigor mortis, or death stiffening, and the object remains grasped by the dead hand until the rigidity passes off. In this case the hand was perfectly rigid, but it did not grasp the hair at all. The little tress lay in the palm quite loosely, and the hand was only partially closed. Obviously the hair had been placed in it after death. The other 2 facts had reference to the condition of the hair itself. Now, when a lock of hair is torn from the head, it is evident that all the roots will be found at the same end of the lock. But in the present instance this was not the case. The lock of hair which lay in the dead woman's hand had roots at both ends, and so could not have been torn from the head of the murderer. But the third fact that I observed was still more conclusive. The hairs of which that little tress was composed had not been pulled out at all. They had fallen out spontaneously. They were, in fact, shed hairs, probably combings. Let me explain the difference. When a hair is shed naturally, it drops out of the little tube in the skin called the root sheath, having been pushed out by the young hair growing up underneath. The root end of such a shed hair shows nothing but a small bulbous enlargement, the root bulb. But when a hair is forcibly pulled out, its root drags out the root sheath with it, and this can plainly be seen as a glistening mass on the end of the hair. If Miriam Goldstein will pull out a hair and pass it to me, I will show you the great difference between hair which is pulled out and hair which is shed. The unfortunate Miriam needed no pressing. In a twinkling she had tweaked out a dozen hairs, which a constable handed across to Thorndyke, by whom they were at once fixed in a paperclip. A second clip being produced from the box, 6 hairs taken from the tress which had been found in the dead woman's hand were fixed in it. Then Thorndyke handed the 2 clips, together with a lens, to the coroner. "Remarkable!" exclaimed the latter, "and most conclusive." He passed the objects on to the foreman, and there was an interval of silence while the jury examined them with breathless interest and much facial contortion. "The next question," resumed Thorndyke, "was whence did the murderer obtain these hairs? I assumed that they had been taken from Miriam Goldstein's hairbrush, but the sergeant's evidence makes it pretty clear that they were obtained from the very bag of combings from which he took a sample for comparison." "I think, Doctor," remarked the coroner, "you have disposed of the hair clue pretty completely. May I ask if you found anything that may throw any light on the identity of the murderer?" "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "I observed certain things which determine the identity of the murderer quite conclusively." He turned a significant glance on Superintendent Miller, who immediately rose, stepped quietly to the door, and then returned, putting something into his jacket. When I entered the hall, Thorndyke continued, I noted the following facts. Behind the door was a shelf on which were 2 china candlesticks. Each was fitted with a candle, and in one was a short candle end about an inch long lying in a tray. On the floor, close to the mat, was a spot of candle wax and some faint marks of muddy feet. The oilcloth on the stairs also bore faint footmarks, made by wet galoshes. They were ascending the stairs and grew fainter towards the top. There were 2 more spots of candle wax on the stairs, and one on the handrail, a burnt end of a wax match halfway up the stairs, and another on the landing. There were no descending footmarks, but one of the spots of wax close to the balusters had been trodden on while warm and soft, and bore the mark of the front of the heel of a galosh descending the stairs. The lock of the street door had recently been oiled, as had also that of the bedroom door, and the latter had been unlocked from outside with a bent wire, which had made a mark on the key. Inside the room I made 2 further observations. One was that the dead woman's pillow was lightly sprinkled with sand, somewhat like silver sand, but greyer and less gritty. I shall return to this presently. The other was that the candlestick on the bedside table was empty. It was a peculiar candlestick, having a skeleton socket formed of 8 flat strips of metal. The charred wick of a burnt-out candle was at the bottom of the socket, but a little fragment of wax on the top edge showed that another candle had been stuck in it and had been taken out, for otherwise that fragment would have been melted. I at once thought of the candle end in the hall, and when I went down again I took that end from the tray and examined it. On it I found 8 distinct marks corresponding to the 8 bars of the candlestick in the bedroom. It had been carried in the right hand of some person, for the warm, soft wax had taken beautifully clear impressions of a right thumb and forefinger. I took 3 moulds of the candle end in moulding wax, and from these moulds have made this cement cast, which shows both the fingerprints and the marks of the candlestick. He took from his box a small white object, which he handed to the coroner. "And what do you gather from these facts?" asked the coroner. "I gather that at about 1:45 on the morning of the crime, a man, who had on the previous day visited the house to obtain the tress of hair and oil the locks, entered the house by means of a latchkey. We can fix the time by the fact that it rained on that morning from 1:30 to 1:45, this being the only rain that has fallen for a fortnight, and the murder was committed about 2 o'clock. The man lit a wax match in the hall and another halfway up the stairs. He found the bedroom door locked and turned the key from outside with the bent wire. He entered, lit the candle, placed the box and hassock, murdered his victim, washed his hands and knife, took the candle end from the socket and went downstairs, where he blew out the candle and dropped it into the tray. The next clue is furnished by the sand on the pillow. I took a little of it and examined it under the microscope, where it turned out to be deep-sea sand from the eastern Mediterranean. It was full of the minute shells called foraminifera. As one of those happened to belong to a species which is found only in the Levant, I was able to fix the locality. "But this is very remarkable," said the coroner. "How on earth could deep-sea sand have got onto this woman's pillow?" "The explanation," replied Thorndyke, "is really quite simple. Sand of this kind is contained in considerable quantities in Turkey sponges. The warehouses in which the sponges are unpacked are often strewn with it ankle deep. The men who unpack the cases become dusted with it, their clothes saturated and their pockets filled with it. If such a person, with his clothes and pockets full of sand, had committed this murder, it is pretty certain that in leaning over the head of the bed in a partly inverted position, he would have let fall a certain quantity of the sand from his pockets and the interstices of his clothing. Now, as soon as I had examined this sand and ascertained its nature, I sent a message to Mr. Goldstein, asking him for a list of the persons who were acquainted with the deceased, with their addresses and occupations. He sent me the list by return, and among the persons mentioned was a man who was engaged as a packer in a wholesale sponge warehouse in the Minories. I further ascertained that the new season's crop of Turkey sponges had arrived a few days before the murder. The question that now arose was whether this sponge packer was the person whose fingerprints I had found on the candle end. To settle this point, I prepared 2 mounted photographs, and having contrived to meet the man at his door on his return from work, I induced him to look at them and compare them. He took them from me, holding each one between a forefinger and thumb. When he returned them to me, I took them home and carefully dusted each on both sides with certain surgical dusting powder. The powder adhered to the places where his fingers and thumbs had pressed against the photographs, showing the fingerprints very distinctly. Those of the right hand were identical with the prints on the candle, as you will see if you compare them with the cast. He produced from the box the photograph of the Yiddish lettering, on the black margin of which there now stood out with startling distinctness a yellowish-white print of a thumb. Thorndyke had just handed the card to the coroner when a very singular disturbance arose. While my friend had been giving the latter part of his evidence, I had observed the man Petrovsky rise from his seat and walk stealthily across to the door. He turned the handle softly and pulled, at first gently and then with more force, but the door was locked. As he realized this, Petrovsky seized the handle with both hands and tore at it furiously, shaking it to and fro with the violence of a madman, and his shaking limbs, his starting eyes, glaring insanely at the astonished spectators, his ugly face dead white, running with sweat, and hideous with terror, made a picture that was truly shocking. Suddenly he let go the handle, and with a horrible cry thrust his hand under the skirt of his coat and rushed at Thorndyke. But the superintendent was ready for this. There was a shout and a scuffle, and then Petrovsky was borne down, kicking and biting like a maniac, while Miller hung on to his right hand and the formidable knife that it grasped. "I will ask you to hand that knife to the coroner," said Thorndyke, when Petrovsky had been secured and handcuffed, and the superintendent had readjusted his collar. "Will you kindly examine it, sir," he continued, "and tell me if there is a notch in the edge near to the point, a triangular notch about 1/8 of an inch long?" The coroner looked at the knife and said in a tone of surprise, "Yes, there is. You have seen this knife before, then?" "No, I have not," replied Thorndyke, "but perhaps I had better continue my statement. There is no need for me to tell you that the fingerprints on the card and on the candle are those of Paul Petrovsky. I will proceed to the evidence furnished by the body. In accordance with your order, I went to the mortuary and examined the corpse of the deceased. The wound has been fully and accurately described by Dr. Davidson, but I observed one fact which I presume he had overlooked. Embedded in the bone of the spine, in the left transverse process of the fourth vertebra, I discovered a small particle of steel which I carefully extracted." He drew his collecting box from his pocket, and taking from it a seed envelope, handed the latter to the coroner. "That fragment of steel is in this envelope," he said, "and it is possible that it may correspond to the notch in the knife blade." Amidst an intense silence the coroner opened the little envelope, and let the fragment of steel drop onto a sheet of paper. Laying the knife on the paper, he gently pushed the fragment towards the notch. Then he looked up at Thorndyke. "It fits exactly," said he. There was a heavy thud at the other end of the room, and we all looked around. Petrovsky had fallen onto the floor, insensible. "An instructive case, Jervis," remarked Thorndyke as we walked homewards. "A case that reiterates the lesson that the authorities still refuse to learn." "What is that?" I asked. "It is this. When it is discovered that a murder has been committed, the scene of that murder should instantly become the palace of the Sleeping Beauty. Not a grain of dust should be moved, not a soul should be allowed to approach it until the scientific observer has seen everything in situ and absolutely undisturbed. No tramplings of excited constables, no rummaging by detectives, no scrambling to and fro of bloodhounds. Consider what would have happened in this case if we had arrived a few hours later. The corpse would have been in the mortuary, the hair in the sergeant's pocket, the bed rummaged, and the sand scattered abroad, the candle probably removed, and the stairs covered with fresh tracks. There would not have been the vestige of a clue. And," I added, "the deep sea would have uttered its message in vain." End of Message from the Deep Sea by Dr. John Jones Pitcairn and R. Austin Freeman. Part 2. Recording by Beth Thomas.